On April 14, 1990, two friends stood at the edge of a beautiful green-blue pond known as Troy Spring in Florida. They didn't know it yet, but shortly after suiting up and swimming down to the cave at the bottom, something would go horrifyingly wrong. This is their story, along with a couple of other horrifying cave stories. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. In the cave diving world, Florida might be best known for its numerous sinkholes, but the state is also home to more freshwater springs than anywhere else in the world. There are more than 700 springs in Florida, and some are considered really special because of their designation as first magnitude springs. To make it into this category, a spring has to discharge at least 64 million gallons of water a day, and only a handful of those 700 do. One of these is Troy Spring, located in Florida's Lafayette County. And Troy Spring not only surpasses that, but it also crushes the mark at 96 million gallons a day. The spring is part of the Floridian aquifer system and connects to several different bodies of water. All of these connections help to distribute water throughout the system, which includes a 325-foot or 99-meter cave-like run. This run is essentially an underwater tunnel where water rushes out from the aquifer with enough force to make it feel like swimming against a fire hose. The run is also located about 70 feet beneath the surface. And because of the current, many of even the world's most experienced cave divers have kept Troy Spring off their to-dive list. In fact, it's so rarely visited that most of the system isn't even mapped. On April 14, 1990, diving Troy Spring was very much on the list of things to do for teenage cousins Clarence and Richard. The two young men had been lifelong best friends in addition to their relation to one another, and they'd spent much of their time together either fishing or hunting. It's unclear where they got the idea to dive Troy Spring, but it was a plan they didn't try to keep secret. Anyone they told, however, warned them it was a terrible and extremely dangerous idea. Unfortunately, the desperate pleading of friends and family members wasn't enough to stop them, though. That Saturday morning, the cousins drove to Troy Spring with whatever dive gear they had available to them. After suiting up with one air tank each, they entered the spring at around 9:15 a.m. and began their descent. Again, in order to reach the run portion of the spring, they'd have to dive down to around 70 feet. And once they reached that spot, one of the cousins pulled out a spool of fishing line to use as a guideline. After fixing one end of it, the outside of the run, the two proceeded ahead into the rushing current. For a few moments, everything was going according to plan. The current was extremely strong, and they felt every bit of this force. But the dive was proceeding nicely until they got to about 55 feet inside. That's when one of the cousins' tanks began to free-flow its air supply. Under normal circumstances, air will only flow through the regulator when a diver inhales. If a regulator starts to free flow, that means it's sending a constant supply of air through the regulator. This can make it feel like you're trying to inhale from a spraying hose. Causes of this can vary from cold water to damaged equipment, but in this case, it was the strong current that caused the tank to change how it was operating. This then caused the diver with the free-flowing tank to begin to panic, which only made the situation worse as the cousins struggled to fix the problem. With the constant spray of gas, it also causes a bunch of bubbles, which can sort of blind a diver. This might seem like it wouldn't be a huge issue, but if you're juggling trying to breathe, being blinded, and swimming against a current, you can see how it would quickly become overwhelming. Ordinarily, a diver might then use the partner's octopus, but the other diver with a working tank didn't have one. An octopus is basically a second regulator that can be used in the case of an emergency. But without one, the two were left with only one option, which was passing the only working regulator back and forth. As they worked to get a hang of this process, the relentless current inside the run was quickly carrying them back to the entrance. Under the circumstances, this might seem like a stroke of luck, but this only served to severely entangle the cousins in their own fishing line. Upon realizing this, the two struggled and pried at the line, trying to free themselves so they could continue toward the surface. But it was quickly growing into a hopeless situation. All the while being carried by the current, fighting against the line, they became so entangled that the line itself was soon keeping them underwater. More panic then ensued, and soon after, the two drowned together while air was still left in the working tank.
At 10:07 a.m., less than an hour after the boys entered Troy Spring, another diver came upon their bodies, but there was nothing he could do to help them. They were already gone. When recovery divers eventually entered the water to retrieve them, they found that the boys were so wrapped up in the fishing line that it took a full 10 minutes to cut them loose. It was determined that several circumstances contributed to the tragedy at Troy Spring in 1990, but it was determined that inexperience and a lack of knowledge about cave diving was the main source of them all. The cousins simply didn't understand or appreciate the potential dangers. While it was good that they thought to bring a guideline to aid their dive, fishing line was also an inadequate choice to use in place of a thicker nylon rope. It's also believed that both divers may have been suffering from nitrogen narcosis. In an ordinary cave without the strong current, they may have made it out, but taken all together, there was simply too much to overcome. At 55 years old, Sabine had spent more than 3 decades in the mountains of southeastern France. Since 1989, she worked as a professional instructor in nature sports, guiding others through the outdoors she loved so much. In addition to being a mountain guide, Sabine was a caving and canyoning guide, a cross-country skier, a Nordic hiking instructor, a mountain biker, and even a snowshoeing coach. In short, she had the kind of expertise that only comes from a lifetime spent outside. And for 30 years, she'd been leading tours into the nearby Sassenage caves. To her, this was just another way to share the world she loved so much with others. The Sassenage Caves was carved out by the Leisure River roughly 1.5 million years ago, and its tunnels have been shaped ever since by the flow of underground water. Like most caves, the tunnels are tight and winding, with stretches that force visitors to stoop or even crawl. And today, it's open to the public through guided tours that let visitors experience a safe introduction to caving. On the morning of May 5, 2022, Sabine was leading a group of 5th graders from a nearby middle school. She was the team leader that day, guiding alongside 4 other professional instructors and a school teacher who had accompanied the class. The students were split into 3 groups, each setting off at staggered times to explore different sections of the cave. Inside the tunnels, the tour moved along as planned. As the morning wore on, the students navigated the narrow passages and damp tunnels as Sabine and her fellow guides kept a close watch. But as noon approached, everything changed. The river outside began to surge, and the normally calm and shallow water started to rise much faster than anyone anticipated. Unbeknownst to those inside the cave, this was because of a sudden flash flood triggered by the rain that had been falling outside. That Thursday, there had been more rain than expected, but the conditions were not considered cause for concern. In that region, spring rainfall is common, and the local, heavily vegetated terrain usually absorbs excess water without issue. Even to someone as experienced as Sabine, or to any of the other guides, there was no reason to expect any danger. But in that moment, as the water began to pour into the tunnels, it was immediately clear they had to leave. The water was climbing fast and literally filling low-ceiling passages that had been dry just moments earlier. In caves like the Sassenage, even a small increase in water volume can turn walkable tunnels into currents of rushing water. The first 2 groups of students were rushed to safety by the time the flood intensified because their guides acted quickly and directed them out through the main passage. Every one of them made it out unharmed, but for the 3rd group, the timing couldn't have been worse. Along with the teacher and 2 other guides, Sabine stayed behind to ensure the last of the students were accounted for. By that point, just a few minutes later, the current had strengthened and the escape routes were closing off fast. Amid the confusion and noise, one of the 5th graders lost her footing and was caught in the rushing waters. Sabine reacted instantly and instinctively to pull the girl back to safety before the water could carry her away. She would manage to grab her, and the students survived because of that split-second decision and reaction. But it left Sabine exposed to the full force of the rising stream. In moments, the situation became uncontrollable. One of Sabine's colleagues watched her struggle against the torrent and then disappear beneath the water. It all happened so fast that it left no time for an attempted rescue or even to shout a warning. Sabine was just gone, washed away by the floodwaters, while the others moved to take shelter in a higher section. By late afternoon, word had reached emergency services that several adults were trapped inside. Around 30 cavers were called in, along with firefighters and local authorities. By 11 p.m., the two guides and the teacher were rescued from the cave, but things had already turned tragic. Just before they were found, Sabine's lifeless body was recovered from one of the lower passages. Because of her quick reaction and selflessness, every one of the students that she'd been guiding made it out alive, but ultimately it cost her her own life. Today, she is remembered as a local hero. At 42 years old, Martin, who was better known to his friends as Marcy, was Hungary's most skilled and respected diver. He was a national champion several times over in navigational scuba diving, and on the world stage, he earned silver and bronze medals in international competitions.
His skills served a much larger purpose in competition, though. He was equally at home exploring dry caves as he was pushing forward Hungary's underwater cave research scene. He'd spent years exploring submerged cave systems across Hungary, Montenegro, and Bosnia, and his friends even used to tease him about his ever-careful approach to diving. Where other divers would spot a clear passage into an unknown and uncharted section of the cave and see opportunity, Marcy would see a reason to stop, go back, and plan before proceeding ahead. So when the phone rang in the office of Andres on the afternoon of Sunday, April 3, 2022, he immediately knew that he would not be receiving good news. As the leader of the Hungarian Cave Rescue Service, Andres had taken plenty of calls like this before. From injured cave explorers to trapped, inexperienced cave divers who went well beyond their means, it was his job to figure out how to produce the best possible outcome. This call was different, though. The voice, on the other hand, was tense as it informed him that a diver had gone missing in Kauszeth Cave in the hills of Hungary's Agalik National Park near the Slovakian border. Earlier that day, a team of highly experienced divers were conducting exploratory dives near what was once thought to be the end of the system in an area known as Siphon 3. Marcy was among them on the way into the sump, but he wasn't on the way out. This news hit Andres hard, and he didn't know how to react. Everyone in the diving community knew Marcy, and if he hadn't come back, something was seriously wrong. So within minutes of receiving the call, Andres was on the road, juggling phone calls and assembling a team while mentally running through every scenario. Unfortunately, he knew the odds weren't in Marcy's favor. He had been underwater for hours by then, far past any realistic survival window. So the best that Andres could hope for was that Marcy had found an air-filled pocket on the other side of Siphon 3. By the time he arrived at Kauszeth Cave around 11 p.m., the area was already crawling with rescuers and support teams. Within minutes of the alert going out, the country's best were already on their way. Hungary has 3 separate cave rescue organizations, and all 3 immediately came together for this one. Tents were being set up, gear was in the process of being sorted, medical teams were forming, and some rescuers were even inside the cave assessing the situation from the dry areas as they waited for orders. As soon as he exited his vehicle, Andres took charge of logistics, making sure the divers who knew the cave best, particularly the area in and around Siphon 3, had everything they needed. Unfortunately, though, there weren't many who fit that bill. In fact, you could count them on one hand, and Marcy was among them. Among the others were 2 veteran divers, Victor and Andres. With more than 25 years of diving experience, Victor had been Marcy's friend and dive partner on countless expeditions. The 2 of them were the only people to have reached the farthest point of Siphon 3. And now, Victor would be the one going back in to find his longtime partner. That, however, would have to wait until the next day. Organizing cave rescues takes time, especially in a cave as complex and challenging as Kauszeth. Located on the edge of a small Hungarian village, Kauszeth Cave is one of the country's most preserved and fascinating natural systems. The cave was first discovered in 1956 when a team of researchers managed to reach the entrance to what became known as the Dry Passage. During that first exploration, they stopped when they made it to the water-filled section, ominously called the Hopeless Siphon. Beyond that, the passage completely disappears underwater. Inside, the cave stream also flows from the siphon through the dry tunnel toward the entrance, pooling into a small lake along the way. And today, the mapped portion of the system stretches roughly 4,921 feet, or 1,500 meters, and drops about 171 feet, or 52 meters vertically. For decades after the discovery, the Hopeless Siphon marked the known limit of exploration, as no one had successfully passed it, despite repeated efforts that continued into the early 2000s.
The A4 Diving Club spent years widening tunnels and installing guidelines in hopes that one day they'd reach further into the system, and that day finally came in 2009 when they managed to get through the hopeless siphon and emerged into a vast chamber they named Our Father's Hall. This chamber ended in another water-filled section, and to move forward, divers had to squeeze through an even tighter underwater passage known as Siphon 2. This led them to another narrow air pocket, and from there into Siphon 3. This last known section descended to a depth of 157 feet or 48 meters, and it was here that something happened to Marcy. Snow still covered the ground outside Cowseth Cave on Monday, April 4th, as rescuers huddled near the entrance and final checks were made on the dive gear. At 4:02 p.m., Victor and Andres descended into the dark cave waters and began to head towards Siphon 3. The plan was to swim to the far end of Siphon 3, assess the situation, and search for any signs of Marcy. But the passage was narrow, visibility was near zero, and the temperature of the water was close to freezing. On the surface, the support team waited as the minutes dragged on for almost an hour when Victor and Andres resurfaced. Victor then reported that he reached the end of the passage, but there wasn't much left of it. The tunnel at Siphon 3 was completely blocked, filled in with collapsed clay and rock debris, and there was no getting past it. Even the guide rope that had once cleanly run through the area was now buried, and there was no safe way forward. Following their dive, rescue organizers gathered around a laptop as Victor reviewed the footage from his helmet camera. The video showed just how murky things were near the collapse, but it unmistakably showed a wall of debris where the tunnel should have been. As they paused and rewound the footage countless times, someone noticed something metallic in one corner of the frame. And once it was pointed out, they determined it was likely the edge of a scuba tank. Right away upon making this discovery, the mood in the room shifted. If that was one of Marcy's tanks, then he might have left it behind and made it through the collapse to an air pocket on the other side. This optimism, however, came from complete uncertainty. No one could say for sure that what they were seeing was one of Marcy's tanks, and even if it was, there was no guarantee it was a sign he was still alive. By nightfall, a new plan formed to get clear footage of the debris and the object that looked like a tank. That plan came to life the following afternoon, and by 5 p.m., Victor and Andres were ready to re-enter Cowseth Cave. Once again, the two disappeared into the water as the support team watched, but just 26 minutes later, Andres resurfaced. He was cold and breathing hard, and once he collected himself, he informed the team he couldn't find a way through Siphon 3. Victor, however, did, and he actually continued on as the rest of the team continued to wait for nearly another hour for him to return. When he finally emerged from the underwater sections of the cave, no one spoke a word. Victor then pulled off his mask and sat there for a moment, catching his breath as every eye in the cave rested on him. The look on his face said it all. Victor had found Marcy, and he was dead. Marcy was about 98 feet or 30 meters into Siphon 3, just beyond the collapsed section. Victor had followed the guideline as far as he could, and there, through the haze of rock and floating sediment, he spotted Marcy's body. The missing diver was still in his full gear and caught in the narrowest part of the tunnel. From the position of his body and his equipment, it looked like he was on his way out of the cave when disaster struck. Outside the entrance of Cowseth Cave, rescuers embraced while others stood silently trying to digest the horrible news that was making its way around. At that moment, the operation shifted from a rescue to a recovery. In the days that followed, once the initial shock faded and the divers got some rest, rescuers turned their attention to understanding what might have gone wrong. The team reviewed dive logs, footage, verbal accounts, and every small piece of data gathered from the collapse section. Little by little, a picture of what happened to Marcy began to form, and organizers could put together a theory of what most likely happened. What they determined was that Marcy was working carefully and methodically, as he always had, at the end of Siphon 3. His last recorded movements showed that he had advanced a few feet beyond the previously explored end of the siphon, and there he attached the guideline to a new anchor point. This was a routine part of extending the mapped route. Visibility at the time was poor, but not unusually so, and certainly presented nothing beyond Marcy's abilities and experience. Once the line was secured to the anchor point, he began turning back toward the exit. And that's when everything changed. At some point during his return, a section of clay and rock from the tunnel ceiling gave way. Divers who examined the site found compacted sediment on top of the guideline and signs that the material had fallen from above. No one could say for certain whether Marcy was struck directly or became trapped by the debris, but it was possible that he died instantly when the collapse occurred. It's also possible that he survived for a short time and was unable to free himself as his air supply slowly dwindled to nothing. Unfortunately, the evidence that experts had available couldn't answer that part. What rescuers did know was that Marcy did not cause the accident. His equipment was in perfect condition and he did everything inside Siphon 3 by the book. The dive was well within his capabilities and he had been his usual cautious self while executing the furthering of the guideline. The tragedy was simply a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Planning for the retrieval of Marcy's body began immediately, and those preparations were complete by Thursday, April 7th. 7 divers then descended into the hopeless sump to act as support while Victor and Andres went deeper, returning to the farthest reaches of Siphon 3. The next day, Andres reached Marcy's body and began preparing it. He placed a black bag over Marcy's head and carefully removed his remaining equipment. He then secured his limbs tightly to his body to make transport possible before guiding him upward a few feet at a time. Victor then took over the next base and brought Marcy to a point just below the siphon entrance. On Saturday, April 9th, the team continued the painstaking work of moving Marcy's body through the underwater tunnels and finally reached Our Father's Hall. It wouldn't be until 10:29 a.m. on Sunday that Andres entered the water for the final stage. When he resurfaced hours later, Marcy's body was with him and onto dry land for the first time